I think it's fun watching the religious stumble around, and there are plenty who just make a career of it. Today, we're going to look at a preacher doing exactly that. This is all done while making claims that cannot be corroborated just because he really wants it to be true. These people have no grasp at all on reality, and that's going to become very, very clear coming up next. We haven't done a Voddie Baucham video lately, so why the heck not? This one asks, what do you do when somebody asks you for proof and it's all going to be excuses for why they can't actually provide any, right? I think we all know that going in. The religious are full of that, well, full of something, and they're just making excuses for why they can't do anything that, if their beliefs were actually true, they ought to be able to do. So let's see what Voddie has to say, because I'm willing to bet it's not going to be impressive.
How would you respond to someone who insists that we need quote-unquote proof for biblical truths?
I'd agree. Now, I'm not answering from a Christian perspective, and certainly not as someone who depends on the collection plate to make ends meet. Now, just out of curiosity, I went and I looked up Voddie Baucham's net worth, and he's worth about $2 million, which, in the scheme of things for the religious, that isn't a whole lot, but his ministry is located in Zambia, so I guess that's not really a huge surprise. Recently, though, he did come back to the US for medical concerns, so I guess we'll have to see if he stays or not. It doesn't really matter. It's just background information, but I wish him well in his continued recovery. And let's just get back to the video.
That depends on how they're defining proof, right?
Notice how much he had to think about that and how much he stumbled over his words, right? If it had been someone like, say, Frank Turek, who gets asked questions like that all the time, I don't think he would have stumbled. He already has a ready answer, or he can just fake one anytime he likes. So does that mean that this guy is actually thinking about it? I don't know. Maybe he was caught by surprise by the question and is trying to formulate an emotionally comforting answer. I guess we'll just have to see. One thing, and I admit this freely, is that after watching these people for years and years on end, it's really hard to think that they're actually being honest or serious. Now, maybe that's just me. I admit that freely, and I'm being overly suspicious, but any critical thinker, I think anyhow, ought to actually care about the reality of their beliefs. And the religious, at least in my opinion, and like I said, we've been doing this for years now, and we've seen it happen over and over again, they just don't. It's all comfort, zero fact. I'd love to have an honest conversation with a serious theist in the comments, because the things that I would do, the things that I wound up doing as a theist, those didn't allow me to remain part of the faith. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who doesn't do those things, no matter what rational conclusion you come to in the end, those point directly to not caring if it's true. And I don't think any of these people really care. And in fact, a lot of them are honest and tell you they don't care. But, what do I know, right?
In 1 Peter 3, as Christians, we're told to always be ready to give a reason to anyone who asks us the reason for the hope that is in us.
Why do I think that if they cut out all the pauses, this would be a 30-second video? But yes, I agree. 1 Peter 3:15 does say that you should always be ready. What he said. And we've also seen a lot of videos by Christian apologists trying desperately to get around that. If you can make any excuse, well, you just don't have to do it, because we know that these people don't even have valid reasons to begin with. They just really want to believe. And I'm curious to see if he's going to make excuses or not, so let's get back to the video and see.
So as Christians, we ought always to be ready to explain what we believe and why we believe it, right? So to that extent, I agree.
There's a but coming. You can just hear it. There shouldn't be, though, right? Now, sure, whoever it was that made the long video making excuses for why you shouldn't tell people why to believe a thing, I think it was Mike Winger, but I could be wrong. Anyway, you can go back and look in the playlist. Those are some pretty decent reasons not to in the exact moment, but not to do it at all? No, of course not. The Bible never says, drop everything you're doing and do it right this instant, and that was what Mike, or whoever it was, chose to focus on. The fact that he would have just slunk off so he didn't have to do it at all, that he would go and hide in his echo chamber so he could pretend he was never asked, well, that's of no importance, right? So I'm really curious to see if Voddie is going to try the same thing. For people supposedly proud of their faith, these people sure are terrified by it, aren't they?
But that's usually not what people are talking about. Usually what they're talking about is scientific proof for historic events. And what I mean by that is this.
No, that is not the case. If you were talking about something that occurs in the real world, which God is supposed to be something that exists in and interacts with reality, then yes, you do need to provide objective evidence, as you would for absolutely anything else. God does not get to be an exception to the rule. The problem is, they can't actually provide any evidence, can they? They've got nothing but wishful thinking and empty faith. And that's exactly why they try to get away from having to do it, because they know just how bad it makes them look. They are not willing to take that next step that says that if they can't provide the things that they really ought to have, that reality says they should have at hand, then they've got no business at all believing it either. Now, I did that. I recognized that if I couldn't find the evidence that made these things make sense in the real world, then I shouldn't believe it. I cared more about the truth than I did about my feelings, and certainly than I did about my faith. And people like Voddie, presumably, since I don't know the man personally, he doesn't. None of them do. I can't say that I've ever met a single theist in my life who actually does. They might say that they do, but they don't show it with their actions, do they? I am not impressed with mere words. Put up or shut up. And the religious, they've got no interest in putting up, and they sure the hell can't shut up. So, anyhow.
Like the scientific method, in order to apply the scientific method, something has to be observable and measurable and repeatable.
As anything that actually exists in reality or which interacts with reality can be. So theists are really left with only two possibilities. Either their gods don't really exist, they're just figments of their own imaginations, or their gods don't interact with reality, which, there goes their theology, right? Because the way that their gods are described in their beliefs, either their gods should be scientifically defensible, which they're not, or their beliefs about their gods are just wrong, which they don't like. Pick one. Or find a third option that's actually defensible. I'm good with that too. Just because they have blind faith, that doesn't make that blind faith true, and they don't want to admit that, do they? They just really want to believe it. My God gets special exceptions to what we insist on for everything else. No, it doesn't. Nobody cares what you want to be true. You haven't shown that your God exists. You haven't shown any way for you to know what your God is like, or if your God is even real in the first place. You just assert it, and asserting things without evidence means nothing. This is, of course, when they run away. These are questions they simply cannot answer. Not that we should really be at all surprised.
Right, we got some science majors in here, right? Right? You got a hypothesis, you got to be able to test the hypothesis, right? Got to be observable, it's got to be measurable, it's got to be repeatable. You don't use the scientific method for historical events.
But we're not talking about historical events, are we? God is not a historical event. Either God is real, or God isn't. Those are really the only two options. All of your claims are grounded on the actual existence of your God. You need to verify that first, and that can only come through science and scientific inquiry. Yet science finds absolutely no evidence for your God at all. This is where they have to yell, "Well, look over there," while they just scamper away, because they can't actually answer these simple, very basic questions, can they? How do you know that your God is real? Faith isn't an answer. You have to have more than faith, and they just don't. This is why 1 Peter 3:15 is so damning for most Christians, because I think they know, at least in the modern world, that most people are going to expect more than just the common "but I believe" nonsense that they've been spewing for centuries. That doesn't fly anymore. People will just laugh at you, and they don't really like getting laughed at. So they just turn tail and run away. They don't really have any choice. They just make excuses because they have nothing of any demonstrable substance to say. It is, again, one of the reasons why they don't want to talk directly to us, because we don't let these half-assed excuses fly. We're not going to take this seriously, and neither should they. Neither should anybody.
They're not observable, right?
Which is why, for actual history, we need primary sources that have been further corroborated by other independent sources. The Gospels, they are not independent. Whoever wrote them, and we don't even know that, they just copied from Mark and then just threw in some ideas on their own. 97% of Mark is found in either Matthew or Luke, often both, and I don't just mean the ideas, I mean they often use the exact same wording. They just copied directly. 24% of Matthew and 23% of Luke are copied from each other. These are not legitimate historical sources. They're just not. They're also not backed up by anything outside of the Bible, especially when you'd expect them to be. Joshua 10 tells the story of the sun stopping in the sky. Now, it's funny that nobody else on the planet, especially the cultures that worship the sun, it's funny they didn't notice that, right? Certainly, none of them bothered to write it down. Matthew 27:53 records zombies rising from the dead and wandering around Jerusalem, but apparently, outside of the Bible, nobody else noticed. These are just myths. They just are. It doesn't matter how much you really wish it was true if you can't back it up with evidence, and that's what's required for them to be considered historical, then you've got nothing. But I think I caught him in the middle of a thought, so please continue.
I can't observe George Washington's presidency. So I don't believe George Washington's presidency by the scientific method.
But you can, because there we have multiple independent corroboratory accounts, we have pictures painted by known artists during his presidency, and we have things that George Washington personally left, letters he wrote, direct and demonstrable evidence that he actually existed. You have none of that for the fairy tales in the Bible. You just really want to believe it's true because it gives you an emotional Woody, but that doesn't make it true. Your emotional state doesn't alter the reality in which you live. It doesn't matter what you want to believe. It just doesn't.
I use an evidentiary method, right? I use the kind of method that you use in a courtroom.
But you don't have that. All you have is anonymous testimony, since we don't know who actually wrote any of the books of the Bible. You have attached names to them, names that you like, but that doesn't mean anything. Here we go back to the simple fact that testimonial evidence is the least accurate, most questionable thing that we have access to. Nobody believes a witness just because they say they saw a thing. Then we just have to go and try to corroborate it. We look to see if they're saying something that is actually true. How do we do that with the Bible? We can't. Sure, we can for some irrelevant facts, like Jerusalem is a place. We can do it for that, but not for anything else, and certainly not for any of the supernatural claims. That's why the Bible isn't a primary source. It fails every single test for historicity. The religious, they'll never accept that, but so what? Reality remains reality, whether you want it to be or not. So this just isn't impressive at all. It just kind of makes him look dumb.
Okay, it's a different approach. It's a different standard.
And there you go. He's playing double standards with his beliefs because he can't get to them with the known working standard that we have. This is pretty normal for the religious, and I've been pointing it out for years. It's just unusual to see one of them admitting it out loud. So there again, he's been stumbling around the whole time, so I guess maybe he just kind of let it slip by mistake. I don't know. However, this is not a strength, this is a weakness to his position. Having to shift your entire epistemic standard because what you really want to be true can't be validated by what we already know works, that's an admission of failure, not that you're willing to be honest about it. We don't need double standards. We need to believe things that can be validated by the standard that we already have, the standard that demonstrably works. This is just acknowledging that his faith is empty. And that's not really a surprise, is it?
So oftentimes what people are asking for is something that doesn't exist.
Yeah. Now, ask yourself a couple of questions. If it doesn't exist, then why do you think it's real? If there's no evidence for any of this crap, why do you believe it? How have you justified it to yourself in any rational way, and how do you demonstrate that to others? Because if you can't answer all of these questions coherently, then you're just making a fool of yourself. You are doing the exact same thing that a flat earther is, or a UFO fanatic, or an evolution denier. And I have no idea what position he has on that last one, but to deny things for which an overwhelming amount of evidence exists just because you don't like the conclusion, that's just idiotic. But these people seem to think that somehow they just have the magical ability to discern fact from fantasy without doing any work or having any evidence to back them up. They just really want to believe, and wanting to believe doesn't mean anything. Wanting to believe is proof that you're an idiot. Please stop.
For any kind of historical event, right? So we have to be able to give a reason, right?
But you're not. You're just providing excuses. You don't understand history or how historians gauge history rationally. This is just one of those lies that floats around in theological circles because it's the only way they can get where they want to go. It's a very basic problem with their epistemology. You don't start with a conclusion like they do. You start with the evidence, and only the evidence, and then you follow it to see where it leads. If it doesn't lead to where you want to go, you don't beat it with a stick until it complies. You just admit that your former conclusion was wrong, and you adopt a new one. But they can't do that, can they?
But the idea that that would be held up to the kind of scrutiny that nothing else in history would be held to, or that it is, philosophically inconsistent with the pursuit of truth concerning those types of events. That's a non-starter.
Yeah.
Right.
Because that's not how history works. I know I keep saying that, but you don't see a lot of historians, actual educated, working historians, that are doing this because they tend to be non-religious. Now, history is a soft science. You can't directly prove that most of it ever happened. At least Voddie got that part right. It has to work from inference and try to cross scientific lines to find corroboration. But it at least tries, most of the time, unless you're talking about religion. Nothing the historians ever say is really a fact. It's not like we can go back in time to see what actually happened. When the evidence runs out, it runs out. We can't look for more. I mean, I guess we can look, but it's not like we can expect to scrape the bottom of the metaphorical barrel once everything in it is gone. We think we know as much as we think we know, and we would never put up the historical method as a replacement for the scientific method on anything in the physical world. That would just be silly. This isn't about truth. This is about a preacher stumbling around and making a fool of himself. He has no clue what he's actually talking about, but then again, none of them do they? After that, They just say some dumb stuff, but I think we're already pretty dumbed out here, so I think we're just going to skip that. The link is in the description if you want to see the last few seconds. It's not impressive. So, what did you think of all this? Are you impressed by Voddie Baucham or not? Because I'm not. Which is why I don't do a lot of his videos. They pop up occasionally, but I usually don't bother. But while we're on that subject, what other theists that I don't do regularly would you like to see more often? You can let me know that down in the comments. I always like seeing what people think, so yeah, do some of that. I'll catch you all next time, and maybe I can make some videos that people are actually curious about, because that's half the fun of doing this at all.